It begins with a moment so ordinary you'd never expect tragedy to hide beneath it. A mother standing in her apartment kitchen. Sunlight spilling across a cluttered counter. A child's bottle left half full beside a cooling cup of coffee. Outside, birds chirp. The world keeps moving. And somewhere between those seconds of normalcy, something irreversible happens. When paramedics arrived, the sound they heard wasn't the chaos they usually expect in an emergency. It was silence. The kind that makes your heart stop, not from fear, but from knowing that you're too late. This is the story of a little boy who should have been safe, and a justice system that somehow convinced itself that safety was optional. Emerson Whitby was only 18 months old, barely old enough to understand what pain was, yet old enough to trust the people who caused it. His story isn't just about abuse. It's about the small, quiet ways society fails children every single day. It's about systems that move too slowly, parents that hide behind charm or excuses, and professionals who mistake compliance for truth. In every line of this story, there's a question we all need to face. What if the people meant to protect us are the same ones looking the other way? When you hear Emerson's name, you won't just remember a victim. You'll remember the face of every child whose bruises were photographed, reported, then filed away under monitor for improvement. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize that the scariest villains don't wear masks. They smile. They post on social media, and they convince everyone around them that they're doing their best. But the truth always lingers. It leaves stains on timelines, contradictions in interviews, and a silence that no verdict can erase. Before we enter the heartbreaking details, let's make one thing clear. This isn't about sensationalizing tragedy. It's about understanding why it keeps happening. It's about asking how many warnings have to be ignored before a system admits it's broken. So tonight, we revisit a case that shattered a family, divided a community, and exposed everything wrong with the way we protect our most vulnerable. The story of Emerson Whitby begins not with an act of violence, but with love, an imperfect, fractured, and complicated kind of love that somehow went horribly wrong. To understand how this all began, we have to start before the tragedy, before headlines, before police tape, before the courtroom. Emerson William Brian Whitby was born on December 2, 2018, in Regina, Canada. To his parents, Chelsea and Riley, he was light in a dark season. They weren't perfect, few couples are, but for a moment they shared something pure. They called him Buggy because he was always on the move, crawling into corners, chasing light, exploring everything he could reach. People described him as happy, fearless, endlessly curious, the kind of child who made everyone smile just by being in the room. But love, as so many of these stories show us, doesn't always survive reality. Chelsea and Riley's relationship had already fractured before Buggy took his first steps. What began as a shared dream became a strained routine, two people trying to co-parent through resentment and exhaustion. Still, they agreed on one thing. They both loved their son. But sometimes, love isn't enough. When Riley came to pick up Buggy for visits, he'd notice small things. Chelsea's tiredness, the slight tension in her voice, the way she'd rush the handoff. He didn't think too deeply about it at first. Everyone gets stressed. Parenthood is hard. But as the months passed, those small moments began to feel heavier, like shadows gathering just outside the frame. Then Chelsea met someone new, Taylor Stewart. He was quiet, polite, the kind of man who seemed dependable at first glance. He had 2 daughters of his own and told friends he wanted stability. To Chelsea, he looked like a fresh start, a second chance at family. They moved quickly, too quickly, maybe. Within months, he'd moved into her apartment, and from the outside, things looked like they were settling. Neighbors heard laughter, little feet running around, the usual sounds of childhood. But sometimes, noise hides pain. Behind closed doors, patterns were forming, missed messages, bruises that needed explanations, a mother who seemed detached from concern, and a boyfriend who stayed in the background, quiet but always present. People often assume that abuse announces itself loudly with screaming, with chaos, but more often it whispers. It hides behind explanations like "kids fall" or "he's just clumsy." It hides in the pauses between texts and the uneasy looks exchanged at drop-offs. It hides in the way adults convince themselves that something isn't quite wrong enough to act on. That's how it began for Emerson, a string of small injuries, each one explained away until the truth could no longer be disguised. It was spring 2020 when the first signs appeared, and as it so often goes, they arrived in whispers, not screams. Riley, who by then had settled into the rhythm of shared custody, noticed a faint bruise on his son's ribs during bath time. It wasn't large, but it didn't look like something from a simple tumble. He asked Chelsea about it, half expecting an easy answer. She smiled, shrugged, said, "He's learning to walk. He bumps into things all the time." The tone was light, the kind that closes conversation without sounding defensive. Riley wanted to believe her. Every separated parent knows the delicate balance between protecting your child and not igniting a war. But within days, new bruises appeared on his ear, his cheek, his tiny eye. Then a bald patch on the top of his head. The little boy who once smiled through everything now winced when touched. Something was wrong. Riley began documenting everything, taking photos, saving dates, keeping notes, because experience had taught him that when you raise concerns, people ask for proof. Yet even with proof, systems often move slower than pain. When he finally asked Chelsea again, her tone changed from light to irritated. "You're overreacting," she said. "He bruises easily." She promised she'd taken him to a doctor to check for iron deficiency. To an outsider, it might sound reasonable. To a father watching his son change before his eyes, it sounded like denial. On May 26, 2020, the truth was no longer ignorable. When Riley went to pick up Buggy, his son's face was swollen, both eyes surrounded by dark bruises that no fall from a crib could explain. Chelsea repeated that story anyway. He'd fallen out of bed, she said. Riley's stomach sank. Still, fear guided his choices. He took photos, called his mother Darla, who gasped when she saw her grandson. She told him to take the boy to a doctor. The pediatrician didn't mince words. If the swelling worsens, go to the hospital. But when Riley called Chelsea to say they needed to go, she argued. "It'll heal on its own," she insisted. Black eyes always look worse before they get better. Imagine being that father knowing something is wrong, yet terrified of making things worse. He worried that if he went against her wishes, she'd shut him out of his son's life. So he made the call most parents pray they'll never have to make. He contacted social services. He sent them the photos. For a moment, it felt like the system was listening. Police visited Chelsea's apartment. They saw the bruises themselves. Emerson was removed from her care and placed with his grandmother, Lisa. That should have been the turning point, the moment the story shifted from danger to safety. But less than a week later, despite clear physical evidence and ongoing concern, social services returned Emerson to his mother. They told Chelsea to check in daily with her mom. A system that had just witnessed harm decided paperwork was enough protection. That decision would change everything. When Emerson was returned to Chelsea's care, it felt less like a decision and more like a gamble. The reasoning was wrapped in bureaucratic, calm official words like monitoring, compliance, family reunification. Words that sound compassionate in theory, but in practice, too often mean we hope nothing bad happens again. Chelsea's mother, Lisa Virtue, was told to check in daily. A grandmother's intuition probably screamed that this wasn't right, but she followed instructions because the people in charge said it would be fine. Meanwhile, Riley's worry grew heavier. He was careful not to start fights. The law can be cruel to fathers who sound too angry, but his instincts told him something irreversible was approaching. When he saw Emerson again that weekend, the boy looked tired, fussier than usual, crying during the car ride home. He assumed it was hunger. He didn't yet know that this would be the last time his son's cries would mean something simple. Later that night, Emerson perked up, playing with his toys, laughing with his grandmother, almost as if life was returning to normal. But by bedtime, his energy faded. He whined through his bath, refused to eat, and by the time Riley tucked him in, he seemed distant quiet in the way toddlers rarely are. Around 8:30 p.m., Riley dropped him back at Chelsea's apartment. Emerson clung to his father for a few seconds longer than usual. Riley didn't know what to make of it. Maybe the boy just didn't want to go home. Maybe he was tired. Maybe his body already knew something his father didn't. The next morning, Chelsea and her boyfriend Taylor Stewart woke up late. On the baby monitor, Emerson appeared asleep. Taylor's 2 daughters were up, getting breakfast. Chelsea decided to let Emerson sleep in. He'd been unwell, she reasoned. Taylor went to buy milk, leaving her alone in the apartment. When he returned an hour later, he saw Chelsea rushing down the stairs, her face pale, Emerson limp in her arms. "He's not breathing," she screamed. Taylor took the boy, tried CPR, while Chelsea dialed 911 with trembling hands. Paramedics arrived fast, but the silence that filled that room said everything before anyone spoke. They managed to get Emerson's pulse back, but his brain had already suffered too long without oxygen. At the hospital, doctors found what Riley had feared all along: massive head trauma, swelling, internal bleeding, old fractures. The medical team didn't need to debate whether this was an accident. They knew what inflicted harm looked like. This wasn't a single fall. It was a pattern. But even with evidence, justice has a strange way of stalling when it comes to the smallest victims. Because in courtrooms, bruises become disputed, timelines become uncertain, and the truth drowns in explanations that sound almost reasonable. The boy everyone called Buggy was gone, and the people who should have protected him began protecting themselves instead. When word spread that Emerson Whitby had died, the shock was immediate, but what followed wasn't the swift demand for accountability you might expect when a toddler dies with bruises and broken ribs. It was confusion. It was hesitation. It was bureaucracy. The police began their investigation by doing what they always do, interviewing the people closest to the child. And from the beginning, something felt off. Chelsea, the mother at the center of it all, seemed more rehearsed than distraught. Her answers were calm, as if she had already practiced them. When asked why she didn't rush her son to the hospital despite visible bruises, she said she was scared of taking him there because of the health situation at the time. 2020 pandemic year. It was an excuse that felt convenient, almost untouchable. She said Emerson was clumsy, that he fell often, that he bruised easily. But there were things she couldn't explain, like the healing fracture in his ribs that doctors discovered days before his death. Her guesses were vague. Maybe he fell down the stairs at her mother's house. Maybe he bumped into something hard. The police pressed, but every answer led nowhere, because she had learned something many suspects do. If you give enough small explanations, it becomes difficult to pin down one big truth. Meanwhile, her boyfriend Taylor Stewart gave his own version. He said Emerson hadn't been feeling well that night, that he was a happy kid who just seemed tired. He admitted Chelsea could be strict, but claimed he never saw her act violently. When asked about discipline, he mentioned a single moment: Chelsea gently scolding Emerson for opening a drawer. That was it. The perfect alibi, a portrait of normal parenting. But behind the scenes, investigators sensed tension. The timeline didn't add up. The bruises didn't match the stories. Still, nothing directly incriminated either adult. The biggest break was supposed to come from a polygraph test, scheduled for Taylor in July. Police believed it might finally confirm who had hurt Emerson. But life or maybe guilt intervened in the cruelest way. Days before his scheduled test, Taylor Stewart was found dead. His truck was discovered in a remote rural area. Police suspected suicide. To some, that confirmed everything they feared, that he was the one responsible and couldn't face what he'd done. But to others, especially those who knew him, it didn't make sense. He was young, close to his family, had plans for the weekend. He loved hunting, fishing, and his daughters. People who saw him days before said he seemed stable, but he did leave behind letters that spoke of depression, of emotional exhaustion, of feeling trapped. They didn't mention guilt, but they didn't have to. His silence left space for everyone else's theories, even Chelsea's. In the weeks following his death, police tapped her phone. They heard her telling a psychic she felt responsible, not for Emerson's death, but for Taylor's. She worried the police would try to blame him. And maybe that's when her composure started to crack, because for the first time, she wasn't in control of the story anymore. The case that should have been straightforward, a child with clear evidence of trauma, was dissolving into fog. The public didn't know what to believe. Some saw Chelsea as a grieving mother unfairly targeted by police. Others saw her as a manipulator hiding behind a mask of innocence. But everyone agreed on one thing. A little boy had died, and somehow, no one was being held accountable. After Taylor Stewart's death, investigators found themselves chasing shadows. One half of the story had vanished forever, and the other half, Chelsea's, kept rearranging itself, depending on who was listening. In one interview, she said Emerson had fallen out of bed. In another, she said he tripped while looking out a window. When pressed on his bruises, she suggested he might have been playing too roughly with Taylor's daughters. When asked about the bald spot, she guessed it was a skin condition. And the black eyes? A malfunctioning bed rail. Her logic was like fog. You could see its shape, but not hold it. Still, she never wavered emotionally. To the officers, she appeared fragile, yet composed, remorseful, yet firm. She even offered to take a polygraph test, but later withdrew after her lawyer advised against it. That detail was enough for her supporters to say, "See? She's cooperating." Yet for detectives, it reinforced what they already suspected. This wasn't cooperation. It was choreography. And behind the choreography was something colder. When police wiretapped her calls, hoping for a confession, what they heard instead was calculation. Chelsea spoke to friends and family with a strange mix of self-pity and control. She told one friend she feared police would pin everything on Taylor. To another, she described herself as being strong for Emerson. But what haunted investigators most was how little she talked about the boy himself. There were no questions about what had happened, no pleas for justice, no moments of wondering if she could have done something differently. It was as if Emerson's death existed only as a problem to manage. The community began to fracture. Some saw Chelsea as a victim of tragedy and small-town gossip, a young mother, punished by a system that loves to point fingers at women, who fail to perform perfect motherhood. Others saw something more sinister, a pattern of neglect and deceit disguised as fragility. Meanwhile, Riley Jolly, the boy's father, was living every parent's nightmare, waiting for the world to decide what his child's life was worth. He replayed every warning, every photo he had taken, every night he chose not to fight harder, and realized that doing everything by the book had still led to the same unbearable outcome. That's the cruelest part of these cases. When systems fail, parents are told to stay calm, follow procedure, trust the process, and when that process collapses, they're left haunted by the idea that maybe they should have broken every rule instead. For investigators, the case was slipping through their fingers. There were too many maybes, too many half-truths, and one critical suspect now gone forever. Still, they pressed forward. They believed the truth hadn't disappeared. It had just changed its disguise. It was hidden somewhere between Chelsea's contradictions, Taylor's silence, and the bruises that kept reappearing long before anyone acted. 3 years after Emerson's death, the courtroom doors finally opened. The people who had been waiting, his father, his grandmothers, the investigators who still had nightmares about the photos, sat in silence, expecting closure. What they got instead was a lesson in how fragile justice really is. Chelsea Whitby stood accused of second-degree murder and manslaughter, charges that carried the weight of every unanswered question. But trials aren't about truth. They're about what can be proven. And in cases like this, proof becomes slippery. Emerson couldn't testify. Taylor was gone, and every adult left behind had a reason to defend their version of events. The prosecution presented the facts. An 18-month-old child with bruises in various stages of healing, a fractured rib, swelling on the brain, and a pattern of neglect. They argued that Chelsea had lashed out in frustration, that her calm demeanor was not grief but guilt. They described how Emerson's injuries couldn't have been caused by accidental falls, how doctors had ruled out every innocent explanation. But the defense countered with a single, devastating argument. What if the fatal injury wasn't new? What if it was a rebleed, a complication from an older trauma that simply resurfaced at the worst possible time? That phrase, reasonable doubt, became the defense's shield. They didn't have to prove innocence. They just had to prove uncertainty. They painted Chelsea as a young, overwhelmed mother, struggling with postpartum anxiety, trying to manage a blended household. They said she was not violent, just unlucky. They questioned the reliability of medical timelines, citing how head injuries in toddlers can rebleed days or even weeks later. In one stroke, they took every bruise, every moment of hesitation, every unanswered question, and reframed it as ambiguity. The witnesses tried to fight back against that narrative. Riley took the stand, his voice cracking as he described the night he found his son covered in bruises. The way Chelsea brushed it off, the nights he stayed awake wondering what else was happening when he wasn't there. He spoke about how he had reported his fears, done everything by the book, and still lost his son. Another ex-boyfriend, Patrick, testified about the time he saw Chelsea swat baby Emerson in frustration while breastfeeding, a moment that had stayed buried until now. But even that detail, raw and damning, was dismissed as a single lapse in judgment. The defense called it a momentary loss of patience, not a pattern of abuse. The trial dragged on, each testimony cutting open old wounds, only to be stitched shut by legal technicalities. When the verdict finally came, it wasn't the cry for justice people hoped to hear. It was silence again. The judge ruled that there was insufficient evidence to prove Chelsea had intentionally harmed her son. The medical testimony, the bruises, the fractures, they were all real, but none of them met the legal standard of certainty. The charges were dismissed. Chelsea walked out of the courtroom free, her face unreadable. The family, left sitting in that same courtroom, stared at the empty space where truth should have been. For them, it wasn't a verdict. It was a betrayal. After the trial ended, what remained wasn't relief or outrage, it was exhaustion. The kind that seeps into the bones of everyone who ever believed that justice naturally follows truth. For Emerson's family, there were no parades, no headlines of victory, no sense of closure. Just paperwork, silence, and the gut-punch realization that the system designed to protect children had once again proven it was better at protecting adults. The agencies involved issued polite statements expressing sympathy, reaffirming commitment to child welfare, promising to review procedures. They used words like tragedy and unfortunate outcome, as if a toddler's death was an accounting error. And then, predictably, they moved on. But families don't move on. Riley didn't. Every night, he replayed the months leading up to that morning. The photos he took, The phone calls he made, the times he hesitated because he didn't want to make waves. That's what the system trains parents to do: be patient, follow protocol, wait your turn. And when that obedience leads to a funeral, there's no one left to answer for it. Chelsea's freedom wasn't just a legal outcome. It was a mirror reflecting a deeper flaw. When investigators and social workers treated her explanations as credible, they weren't just overlooking red flags, they were validating them. They accepted charm over consistency, composure over truth. They told themselves they were preserving a family when, in reality, they were preserving an image of motherhood that society finds comforting: the struggling single mom, misunderstood, deserving of a second chance. The irony is unbearable. The very institutions built to protect the vulnerable are often paralyzed by the fear of seeming too harsh, too judgmental, too biased. And so, time after time, they err on the side of caution, until caution becomes complicity. Emerson's bruises weren't just evidence of violence. They were evidence of every moment someone decided to believe words instead of wounds. Public reaction to the verdict was divided. Some saw a system that had gone soft. Others saw a mother who had survived both tragedy and prosecution. Online debates turned cruel, with strangers dissecting grief like it was entertainment. Yet amid the noise, one truth remained steady: an 18-month-old boy had died, and no one was accountable. The questions that haunted investigators now echoed through the community. How many warnings had to be ignored? Why was he returned to her care so soon? Why didn't anyone intervene when it still mattered? The more people looked at the timeline, the more glaring the cracks became. Each agency had done something, yet no one had done enough. It was the perfect failure one, where every participant could technically claim they'd followed procedure. But procedures don't save lives. Decisions do. Emerson's case wasn't an isolated story. It was part of a pattern, one repeated in towns and cities everywhere. The faces and names change, but the sequence stays the same. A report is filed. A child is checked on, reassurance is given. And then another obituary is written. If this story feels unbearable to hear, imagine living it. Imagine sitting in a courtroom and hearing that the bruises on your baby's face are legally meaningless. Imagine being told the person you trusted with your child's life is now free to walk away without consequence. For many, that kind of pain doesn't end. It just changes form. It becomes advocacy, anger, or in some cases, silence. But silence is exactly what allowed this to happen. After the cameras stopped rolling and the journalists moved on to fresher tragedies, the story of Emerson Whitby faded from public memory, but for those who loved him, it never ended. Riley's house stayed exactly as it was the day his son last visited. The small blanket on the couch, the toy car on the shelf, even the fingerprints on the window, all untouched, preserved like evidence of a world that used to make sense. He would wake up some mornings and still expect to hear his son's giggle from the next room. Grief isn't loud. It's quiet, repetitive, and cruel. It's the sound of a father scrolling through old photos at 2 a.m, whispering apologies to a child who can't hear them anymore. For Chelsea, life took a different shape. The public saw less of her after the verdict, but whispers followed her everywhere online, in the streets, in the quiet judgment of people who had seen too much to forget. Some believed she was innocent, that she had simply been unlucky. Others couldn't reconcile the calmness she displayed with the horror of what had happened. And then there were those who didn't care about innocence or guilt anymore. They just wanted to understand how a system could hand a child back to danger and call it procedure. Taylor Stewart's family carried their own burden. His suicide left questions that could never be answered, and guilt that couldn't be assigned. Did he know what was happening? Did he cause it? Or did he simply break under the weight of suspicion and loss? His letters didn't confess, but they didn't absolve either. They were full of love, regret, and exhaustion, the words of a man who couldn't bear the noise anymore. His daughters grew up carrying a story that made no sense, one they would have to retell in fragments for the rest of their lives. The families orbiting this case, Riley's, Chelsea's, Taylor's, were all changed by something invisible yet irreversible: the collapse of trust. When the people who were supposed to protect the child failed, it left behind a kind of rot that seeps into everything: faith in law, faith in fairness, faith in humanity. And yet, in a painful twist, everyone involved had once believed they were doing their best. The doctor who told Riley to monitor the bruises, the social worker who authorized Emerson's return, the judge who said there was reasonable doubt. Each of them played a part in a story that ended the same way it began, with silence. But there's another kind of silence, too, the one people choose to break. After the verdict, Riley didn't disappear. He started showing up at child welfare hearings, writing letters, speaking to journalists when no one else would. He didn't want revenge. He wanted reform. He said he never wanted another father to sit in that same courtroom, hearing that his son's pain didn't meet the threshold for justice. He believed that change didn't come from outrage, it came from persistence. And maybe that's what it means to love someone you've lost, to keep fighting for them long after the world has stopped listening. Emerson's story became a quiet warning whispered through other families, other courts, other small towns. It wasn't the kind of story people share at dinner tables, but it was the kind they remembered when they saw a bruise that didn't look right, or a parent's excuse that sounded too easy. In that way, Buggy lived on not as a victim, but as a question that demanded to be asked again and again. How many signs do we need before we decide to protect the child, instead of protecting our comfort? There's something deeply unsettling about stories like Emerson Whitby's. They don't end neatly. There are no heroes, no clear villains, just a tangle of decisions made by people who each thought they were doing enough. But when you pull back, you realize that enough was never enough. A child died not because no one cared, but because everyone assumed someone else would fix it. The police assumed social services would handle it. Social services assumed family oversight would prevent harm. The courts assumed evidence would speak for itself. And in that space between assumptions, an 18-month-old boy fell through every layer of protection we're told to trust. When we talk about child protection, we often talk about prevention. We use words like intervention, monitoring, follow-up. But those words mean nothing when they aren't paired with action. Emerson's case wasn't an anomaly. It was a mirror reflecting how we've learned to normalize danger, how we tell ourselves that bruises heal, that good intentions absolve neglect, that paperwork equals safety. The truth is, the system didn't fail because it lacked rules. It failed because it lacked courage. It's easier to close a case than to confront a parent who might hurt their child. It's easier to call a death unfortunate than to admit that negligence and fear cost a life. And maybe that's the hardest truth to face. Institutions don't kill children, but their silence lets it happen. Every ignored warning, every delayed report, every misplaced belief that love can fix everything. Those are choices. And choices, not monsters, are what destroy families. For Chelsea, there may never be another courtroom, no new charges, no retrial. She's free to rebuild her life, to rewrite her story however she wants. But freedom doesn't erase truth. Somewhere, deep inside the quiet moments she avoids, the weight of what happened still exists. Maybe she calls it bad luck. Maybe she calls it fate. But those words will never change the reality of a small boy who trusted her and never got the chance to grow up. For Riley, life will always be divided into two parts: before and after. Before, he was a young father learning how to co-parent, how to make things work. After, he became a man haunted by the idea that he did everything right and still lost everything. But maybe his story, the way he continues to speak, to fight, to remember, can serve as the counterbalance to everything that went wrong. Because the only thing more powerful than silence is persistence. And for us, the ones watching from the outside, our responsibility is simple: to stop turning away. When we see bruises that don't add up, when we hear excuses that feel too neat, when something in our gut tells us a child isn't safe, that's not paranoia. That's humanity. And it's time we start listening to it. Emerson's story should never have been possible, but since it was, it must mean something. His life, though short, should remind us that protecting children isn't just a duty, it's a collective promise. One that can't wait until after tragedy to matter. In memory of Emerson Whitby. May his story not end with a verdict, but with awareness. May his silence become our voice. Asterisk, the tragedy of Emerson. Whitby's story isn't just about one child. It's about the cost of hesitation, the danger of bureaucracy, and the collective failure to act when the signs were right in front of us. His life demands more than sympathy. It demands accountability, awareness, and courage from everyone who has the power to speak up. The system doesn't change by itself. It changes when ordinary people decide that silence is no longer an option.